chapters 12 and 13 of The Man Who Is Thursday. Chapter 12, The Earth in Anarchy. Urging the horses to a gallop without respect to the rather rugged descent of the road, the horsemen soon regained their advantage over the men on the march, and at last the bulk of the first buildings of Lancey cut off the sight of their pursuers. Nevertheless, the ride had been a long one, and by the time they reached the real town, the west was warming with the color and quality of sunset. The colonel suggested that, before making finally for the police station, they should make the effort, in passing, to attach themselves to one more individual who might be useful. 4 out of the 5 rich men in this town, he said, are common swindlers. I suppose the proportion is pretty equal all over the world. The 5th is a friend of mine and a very fine fellow. And what is even more important from our point of view, he owns a motor car. I am afraid, said the professor in his mirthful way, looking back along the white road on which the black crawling patch might appear at any moment, I am afraid we have hardly time for afternoon calls. Dr. Renard's house is only 3 minutes off, said the colonel. Our danger, said Dr. Bull, is not 2 minutes off. Yes, said Syme. If we ride on fast, we must leave them behind, for they are on foot. He has a motor car, said the colonel, but we may not get it, said Bull. Yes, he is quite on our side, but he might be out. Hold your tongue, said Syme suddenly. What is that noise? For a second they all sat still as equestrian statues, and for a second, for 2 or 3 or 4 seconds, heaven and earth seemed equally still. Then all their ears in an agony of attention heard along the road that indescribable thrill and throb that means only one thing: horses. The colonel's face had an instantaneous change, as if lightning had struck it and yet left it scatheless. They have done us, he said with brief military irony. Prepare to receive cavalry. Where can they have got the horses? Asked Syme, as he mechanically urged his steed to a canter. The colonel was silent for a little. Then he said in a strained voice, I was speaking with strict accuracy when I said that the Salon d'Or was the only place where one can get horses within 20 miles. No, said Syme violently, I don't believe he'd do it, not with all that white hair. He may have been forced, said the colonel gently. They must be at least 100 strong, for which reason we are all going to see my friend Renard, who has a motor car. With these words he swung his horse suddenly round a street corner, and went down the street with such thundering speed that the others, though already well at the gallop, had difficulty in following the flying tail of his horse. Dr. Renard inhabited a high and comfortable house at the top of a steep street, so that when the riders lit at his door, they could once more see the solid green ridge of the hill, with the white road across it, standing up above all the roofs of the town. They breathed again to see that the road was as yet clear, and they rang the bell. Dr. Renard was a beaming, brown-bearded man, a good example of that silent but very busy professional class which France has preserved even more perfectly than England. When the matter was explained to him, he pooh-poohed the panic of the ex-marquis altogether. He said, with the solid French skepticism, that there is no conceivable probability of a general anarchist rising. Anarchy, he said, shrugging his shoulders, it is childishness. Et cas, cried the colonel suddenly, pointing over the other's shoulder. And that is childishness, isn't it? They all looked round and saw a curve of black cavalry come sweeping over the top of the hill with all the energy of Attila. Swiftly as they rode, however, the whole rank still kept together, and they could see the black vizards of the first line as level as a line of uniforms. But although the main black square was the same, though travelling faster, there was now one sensational difference, which they could see clearly upon the slope of the hill, as if on a slanted map. The bulk of the riders were in one block, but one rider flew far ahead of the column, and with frantic movements of hand and heel urged his horse faster and faster, so that one might have fancied that he was not the pursuer, but the pursued. But even at that great distance they could see something so fanatical, so unquestionable in his figure, that they knew it was the secretary himself. "I am sorry to cut short a cultured discussion," said the colonel, "but can you lend me your motor car now, in 2 minutes?" "I have a suspicion that you are all mad," said Dr. Renard, smiling sociably. "But God forbid that madness should in any way interrupt friendship. Let us go round to the garage." Dr. Renard was a mild man with monstrous wealth. His rooms were like the Musée de Cluny, and he had 3 motor cars. These, however, he seemed to use very sparingly, having the simple tastes of the French middle class, and when his impatient friends came to examine them, it took some time to assure themselves that even one of them could be made to work. This, with some difficulty, they brought round into the street before the doctor's house. When they came out of the dim garage, they were startled to find that twilight had already fallen with the abruptness of night in the tropics. Either they had been longer in the place than they imagined, or some unusual canopy of cloud had gathered over the town. They looked down the steep streets, and seemed to see a slight mist coming up from the sea. "It is now or never," said Dr. Bull. "I hear horses." "No," corrected the professor, "a horse." And as they listened, it was evident that the noise rapidly coming nearer on the rattling stones was not the noise of the whole cavalcade, but that of the one horseman, who had left it far behind, the insane secretary. Syme's family, like most of those who end in the simple life, had once owned a motor, and he knew all about them. He had leapt at once into the chauffeur's seat, and with a flushed face was wrenching and tugging at the disused machinery. He bent his strength upon one handle, and then said quite quietly, "I'm afraid it's a no-go." As he spoke, there swept round the corner a man, rigid on his rushing horse, with the rush and rigidity of an arrow. He had a smile that thrust out his chin as if it were dislocated. He swept alongside the stationary car, into which his company had crowded, and laid his hand on the front. It was the secretary, and his mouth went quite straight in the solemnity of triumph. Syme was leaning hard upon the steering wheel, and there was no sound but the rumble of the other pursuers riding into the town. Then there came quite suddenly a scream of scraping iron, and the car leapt forward. It plucked the secretary clean out of his saddle as a knife is whipped out of its sheath, trailed him kicking terribly for 20 yards, and left him flung flat upon the road in front of his frightened horse. As the car took the corner of the street with a splendid curve, they could just see the other anarchists filling the street and raising their fallen leader. "I can't understand why it has grown so dark," said the professor at last in a low voice. "Going to be a storm, I think," said Dr. Bull. "I say, it's a pity we haven't got a light on this car, if only to see by." "We have," said the colonel, and from the floor of the car he fished up a heavy, old-fashioned carved iron lantern with a light inside it. It was obviously an antique, and it would seem as if its original use had been in some way semi-religious, for there was a rude moulding of a cross upon one of its sides. "Where on earth did you get that?" asked the professor. "I got it where I got the car," answered the colonel, chuckling, "from my best friend. While our friend here was fighting with the steering wheel, I ran up the front steps of the house and spoke to Renard, who was standing in his own porch, you will remember. 'I suppose,' I said, 'there's no time to get a lamp.' He looked up, blinking amiably at the beautiful arched ceiling of his own front hall. From this was suspended, by chains of exquisite ironwork, this lantern, one of the 100 treasures of his treasure house. By sheer force he tore the lamp out of his own ceiling, shattering the painted panels and bringing down 2 blue vases with his violence. Then he handed me the iron lantern, and I put it in the car. Was I not right when I said that Dr. Renard was worth knowing?" "You were," said Syme seriously, and hung the heavy lantern over the front. There was a certain allegory of their own whole position in the contrast between the modern automobile and its strange ecclesiastical lamp. Hitherto they had passed through the quietest part of the town, meeting at most 1 or 2 pedestrians, who could give them no hint of the peace or the hostility of the place. Now, however, the windows in the houses, one by one, began to be lit up, giving a greater sense of habitation and humanity. Dr. Bull turned to the new detective who had led their flight, and permitted himself one of his natural and friendly smiles. These lights make one feel more cheerful." Inspector Radcliffe drew his brows together. "There is only one set of lights that make me more cheerful," he said, "and they are those lights of the police station, which I can see beyond the town. Please God, may we be there in 10 minutes." Then all Bull's bullying good sense and optimism broke suddenly out of him. "Oh, this is all raving nonsense," he cried. "If you really think that ordinary people in ordinary houses are anarchists, then you must be madder than an anarchist yourself. If we turned and fought these fellows, the whole town would fight for us." "No," said the other with an immovable simplicity. "The whole town would fight for them. We shall see." While they were speaking, the professor had leant forward with a sudden excitement. "What is that noise?" he said. "Oh, the horses behind us, I suppose," said the colonel. "I thought we had got clear of them." "The horses behind us? No," said the professor. "It is not horses, and it is not behind us." Almost as he spoke, across the end of the street before them, two shining and rattling shapes shot past. They were gone almost in a flash, but everyone could see that they were motor cars, and the professor stood up with a pale face and swore that they were the other two motor cars from Dr. Renard's garage. "I tell you, they were his," he repeated with wild eyes, "and they were full of men in masks." "Absurd," said the colonel angrily. "Dr. Renard would never give them his cars." "He may have been forced," said Ratcliffe quietly. "The whole town is on their side." "You still believe that?" asked the colonel incredulously. "You will all believe it soon," said the other with a hopeless calm. There was a puzzled pause for some little time, and then the colonel began again abruptly. "No, I can't believe it. The whole thing is nonsense. The plain people of a peaceable French town." He was cut short by a bang and a blaze of light which seemed close to his eyes. As the car sped on, it left a floating patch of white smoke behind it, and Syme heard a shot streak past his ear. "My God!" said the colonel. "Someone has shot at us." "It need not interrupt conversation," said the gloomy Ratcliffe. "Pray resume your remarks, Colonel. You were talking, I think, about the plain people of a peaceable French town." The staring colonel was long past minding satire. He rolled his eyes all around the street. "It is extraordinary," he said. "Most extraordinary." "A fastidious person," said Syme, "might even call it unpleasant." Are you okay over there? I think my cat is licking my guitar case. Let me get back to where we were. Okay. "It is extraordinary," he said, "most extraordinary." "A fastidious person," said Syme, "might even call it unpleasant. However, I suppose those lights, out in the field beyond the street, are the gendarmerie. We shall soon get there." "No," said Inspector Ratcliffe, "we shall never get there." He had been standing up and looking keenly ahead of him. Now he sat down and smoothed his sleek hair with a weary gesture. "What do you mean?" asked Bull sharply. "I mean that we shall never get there," said the pessimist placidly. "They have 2 rows of armed men across the road already. I can see them from here. The town is in arms, as I said it was. I can only wallow in the exquisite comfort of my own exactitude." And Ratcliffe sat down comfortably in the car and lit a cigarette, but the others rose excitedly and stared down the road. Syme had slowed down the car as their plans became doubtful, and he brought it finally to a standstill, just at the corner of a side street that ran down very steeply to the sea. The town was mostly in shadow, but the sun had not sunk. Wherever its level light could break through, it painted everything a burning gold. Up this side street the last sunset light shone as sharp and narrow as the shaft of artificial light at the theatre. It struck the car of the 5 friends and lit it up like a burning chariot. But the rest of the street, especially the 2 ends of it, was in the deepest twilight, and for some seconds they could see nothing. Then Syme, whose eyes were the keenest, broke into a little bitter whistle and said, "It is quite true. There is a crowd or an army or some such thing across the end of that street." "Well, if there is," said Bull impatiently, "it must be something else, a sham fight or the mayor's birthday or something. I cannot and will not believe that plain jolly people in a place like this walk about with dynamite in their pockets. Get on a bit, Syme, and let us look at them." The car crawled about 100 yards farther, and they were all startled by Dr. Bull breaking into a high crow of laughter. "Why, you silly mugs," he cried, "what did I tell you? That crowd's as law-abiding as a cow, and if it weren't, it's on our side." "How do you know?" asked the professor, staring. "You blind bat," cried Bull. "Don't you see who is leading them?" They peered again, and then the colonel, with a catch in his voice, cried out, "Why, it's Renard!" There was indeed a rank of dim figures running across the road, and they could not be clearly seen, but far enough in front to catch the accident of the evening light was stalking up and down the unmistakable Dr. Renard, in a white hat, stroking his long brown beard, and holding a revolver in his left hand. "What a fool I've been!" exclaimed the colonel. "Of course the dear old boy has turned out to help us." Dr. Bull was bubbling over with laughter, swinging the sword in his hand as carelessly as a cane. He jumped out of the car and ran across the intervening space, calling out, "Dr. Renard! Dr. Renard!" An instant after, Syme thought his own eyes had gone mad in the head, for the philanthropic Dr. Renard had deliberately raised his revolver and fired twice at Bull, so that the shots rang down the road. Almost at the same second as the puff of white cloud went up from this atrocious explosion, a long puff of white cloud went up also from the cigarette of the cynical Ratcliffe. Like all the rest, he turned a little pale, but he still smiled. Dr. Bull, at whom the bullets had been fired, just missing his scalp, stood quite still in the middle of the road without a sign of fear, then turned very slowly and crawled back to the car and climbed in with 2 holes through his hat. "Well," said the cigarette smoker slowly, "what do you think now?" "I think," said Dr. Bull with precision, "that I am lying in bed at number 217 Peabody Buildings, and I shall soon wake up with a jump. Or if that's not it, I think that I am sitting in a small cushioned cell in Hanwell, and that the doctor can't make much of my case. But if you want to know what I don't think, I'll tell you. I don't think what you think. I don't think, and I never shall think, that the mass of ordinary men are a pack of dirty modern thinkers. No, sir, I'm a Democrat, and I still don't believe that Sunday could convert one average navvy or counter-jumper. No, I may be mad, but humanity isn't." Syme turned his bright blue eyes on Bull with an earnestness which he did not commonly make clear. "You are a very fine fellow," he said. "You can believe in a sanity which is not merely your sanity, and you're right enough about humanity, about peasants and people like that jolly old innkeeper. But you're not right about Renard. I suspected him from the first. He's rationalistic, and what's worse, he's rich. When duty and religion are really destroyed, it will be by the rich." "They are really destroyed now," said the man with the cigarette, and rose with his hands in his pockets. "The devils are coming on." The men in the motor car looked anxiously in the direction of his dreamy gaze, and they saw that the whole regiment at the end of the road was advancing upon them. Dr. Renard marching furiously in front, his beard flying in the breeze. The colonel sprang out of the car with an intolerant exclamation. "Gentlemen," he cried, "the thing is incredible. It must be a practical joke. If you knew Renard as I do, it's like calling Queen Victoria a dynamiter. If you had got the man's character into your head—" "Dr. Bull," said Syme sardonically, "has at least got it into his hat." "I tell you it can't be," cried the colonel, stamping. "Renard shall explain it. He shall explain it to me," and he strode forward. "Don't be in such a hurry," drawled the smoker. "He will very soon explain it to all of us." But the impatient colonel was already out of earshot, advancing toward the enemy. The excited Dr. Renard lifted his pistol again, but perceiving his opponent, hesitated, and the colonel came face to face with him with frantic gestures of remonstrance. "It is no good," said Syme. "He will never get anything out of that old heathen. I vote we drive bang through the thick of 'em, bang as the bullets went through Bull's hat. We may all be killed, but we must kill a tidy number of them." "I won't have it," said Dr. Bull, growing more vulgar in the sincerity of his virtue. "The poor chaps may be making a mistake. Give the colonel a chance." "Shall we go back, then?" asked the professor. "No," said Ratcliffe in a cold voice. "The street behind us is held too. In fact, I seem to see there another friend of yours, Syme." Syme spun around smartly and stared backwards at the track where they had traveled. He saw an irregular body of horsemen gathering and galloping toward them in the gloom. He saw above the foremost saddle the silver gleam of a sword, and then as it grew nearer, the silver gleam of an old man's hair. The next moment, with a shattering violence, he had swung the motor car round and sent it dashing down the steep side street to the sea, like a man that desired only to die. I think I need to close the door real quickly because Tommy is shaking something in the other room. 1 second. Oh dear. It was not easy to get up and down from here. Okay, we're back. Okay, so, the poor chaps may be making a mistake. Give the colonel a chance. Oh wait, we're farther down than that. Okay, he had swung the motor car round and sent it dashing down the steep side street to the sea, like a man that desired only to die. What the devil is up? Cried the professor, stealing his arm. The morning star has fallen, said Syme, as his own car went down to the darkness, like a falling star. The others did not understand his words, but when they looked back at the street, above they saw the hostile cavalry coming round the corner and down the slopes after them, and foremost of all rode the good innkeeper, flushed with the fiery innocence of the evening light. The world is insane, said the professor, and buried his face in his hands. No, said Dr. Bull in adamantine humility. It is I. What are we going to do? Asked the professor. At this moment, said Syme with scientific detachment, I think we are going to smash into a lamppost. The next instant, the automobile had come with a catastrophic jar against an iron object. The instant after that, 4 men had crawled out from under a chaos of metal, and a tall, lean lamppost that had stood up straight on the edge of the marine parade stood out, bent and twisted like the branch of a broken tree. Well, we smashed something, said the professor with a faint smile. That's some comfort. You're becoming an anarchist, said Syme, dusting his clothes with his instinct of daintiness. Everyone is, said Ratcliffe. As they spoke, the white-haired horseman and his followers came thundering from above, and almost at the same moment a dark string of men ran shouting along the seafront. Syme snatched a sword and took it in his teeth. He stuck 2 others under his armpits, took a 4th in his left hand, and a lantern in his right, and leapt off the high parade onto the beach below. The others leapt after him with a common acceptance of such decisive action, leaving the debris in the gathering mob above them. We have one more chance, said Syme, taking the steel out of his mouth. Whatever all this pandemonium means, I suppose the police station will help us. We can't get there, for they hold the way. But there's a pier or breakwater runs out into the sea just here, which we could defend longer than anything else, like Horatius and his bridge. We must defend it till the gendarmerie turn out. Keep after me. They followed him as he went crunching down the beach, and in a second or two their boots broke not only the sea gravel, but on broad flat stones. They marched down a long, low jetty, running out in one arm into the dim, boiling sea, and when they came to the end of it, they felt that they had come to the end of their story. They turned and faced the town. That town was transfigured with uproar. All along the high parade from which they had just descended was a dark and roaring stream of humanity, with tossing arms and fiery faces groping and glaring towards them. The long dark line was dotted with torches and lanterns, but even when no flame lit up a furious face, they could see in the farthest figure, in the most shadowy gesture, an organized hate. It was clear that they were the most accursed of all men, and they knew not why. 2 or 3 men, looking little and black like monkeys, leapt over the edge as they had done, and dropped onto the beach. These came plowing down the deep sand, shouting horribly, and strove to wade into the sea at random. The example was followed, and the whole black mass of men began to run and drip over the edge like black treacle. Foremost among the men on the beach, Syme saw the peasant who had driven their cart. He splashed into the surf on a huge cart horse and shook his axe at them. "The peasant!" cried Syme. "They have not risen since the Middle Ages." "Even if the police do come now," said the professor mournfully, "they can do nothing with this mob." "Nonsense," said Dr. Bull desperately. "There must be some people left in the town who are human." "No," said the hopeless inspector, "the human being will soon be extinct. We are the last of mankind." "It may be," said the professor absently. Then he added in his dreamy voice, "What is all that at the end of the Dunciad? Nor public flame nor private dares to shine, nor human life is left, nor glimpse divine. Lo, thy dread empire chaos is restored, light dies before thine uncreating word. Thy hand, great Anarch, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness buries all." "Stop!" cried Bull suddenly. "The gendarmes are out!" The low lights of the police station were indeed blotted and broken with hurrying figures, and they heard through the darkness the clash and jingle of a disciplined cavalry. "They are charging the mob!" cried Bull in ecstasy or alarm. "No," said Syme, "they are formed along the parade." "They've unslung their carbines!" cried Bull, dancing with excitement. "Yes," said Ratcliffe, "and they are going to fire on us." As he spoke there came a long crackle of musketry, and bullets seemed to hop like hailstones on the stones in front of them. "The gendarmes have joined them!" cried the Professor, and struck his forehead. "I am in the padded cell," said Bull solidly. There was a long silence, and then Ratcliffe said, looking out over the swollen sea, all a sort of grey-purple, "What does it matter who is mad or who is sane? We shall all be dead soon." Syme turned to him and said, "You are quite hopeless, then?" Mr. Ratcliffe kept a stony silence. Then at last he said quietly, "No, oddly enough, I am not quite hopeless. There is one insane little hope that I cannot get out of my mind. The power of this whole planet is against us, yet I cannot help wondering whether this one silly little hope is hopeless yet." "In what or whom is your hope?" asked Syme with curiosity. "In a man I never saw," said the other, looking at the leaden sea. "I know what you mean," said Syme in a low voice, "the man in the dark room." "But Sunday must have killed him by now." "Perhaps," said the other steadily, "but if so, he was the only man whom Sunday found it hard to kill." "I heard what you said," said the Professor with his back turned. "I also am holding hard on to the thing I never saw." All of a sudden Syme, who was standing as if blind with introspective thoughts, swung round and cried like a man waking from sleep. "Where is the Colonel? I thought he was with us." "The Colonel, yes," cried Bull. "Where on earth is the Colonel?" "He went to speak to Renard," said the Professor. "We cannot leave him among all those beasts," cried Syme. "Let us die like gentlemen if—" "Do not pity the Colonel," said Ratcliffe with a pale sneer. "He is extremely comfortable. He is—" "No, no, no," said Syme in a kind of frenzy. "Not the Colonel too. I will never believe." "Will you believe your eyes?" asked the other, and pointed to the beach. Many of their pursuers had waded into the water, shaking their fists, but the sea was rough, and they could not reach the pier. 2 or 3 figures, however, stood on the beginning of the stone footway, and seemed to be cautiously advancing down it. The glare of a chance lantern lit up the faces of the 2 foremost. One face wore a black half-mask, and under it the mouth was twisting about in such a madness of nerves that the black tuft of beard wriggled round and round like a restless living thing. The other was the red face and white moustache of Colonel de Croix. They were in earnest consultation. "Yes, he is gone too," said the Professor, and sat down on the stone. "Everything's gone. I'm gone. I can't trust my own bodily machinery. I feel as if my own hand might fly up and strike me." "When my hand flies up," said Syme, "it will strike somebody else." And he strode along down the pier toward the Colonel, the sword in one hand and the lantern in the other. As if to destroy last hope or doubt, the Colonel, who saw him coming, pointed his revolver at him and fired. The shot missed Syme, but struck his sword, breaking it short at the hilt. Syme rushed on, and swung the iron lantern above his head. "Judas before Herod," he said, and struck the Colonel down upon the stones. Then he turned to the secretary, whose frightful mouth was almost foaming now, and held the lamp high with so rigid and arresting a gesture that the man was, as it were, frozen for a moment, and forced to hear. "Do you see this lantern?" cried Syme in a terrible voice. "Do you see the cross carved on it and the flame inside? You did not make it. You did not light it. Better men than you, men who could believe and obey, twisted the entrails of iron and preserved the legend of fire. There is not a street you walk on, there is not a thread you wear that was not made as this lantern was, by denying your philosophy of dirt and rats. You can make nothing. You can only destroy. You will destroy mankind. You will destroy the world. Let that suffice you. Yet this one old Christian lantern you shall not destroy. It shall go where your empire of apes will never have the wit to find it." He struck the secretary once with the lantern so that he staggered, and then whirling it twice around his head sent it flying far out to sea, where it flared like a roaring rocket and fell. "Swords!" shouted Syme, turning his flaming face to the three behind him. "Let us charge these dogs, for our time has come to die." His three companions came after him, sword in hand. Syme's sword was broken, but he rent a bludgeon from the fist of a fisherman, flinging him down. In a moment they would have flung themselves upon the face of the mob and perished, when an interruption came. The secretary, ever since Syme's speech, had stood with his hands to his stricken head as if dazed. Now he suddenly pulled off his black mask. The pale face thus peeled in the lamplight revealed not so much rage as astonishment. He put up his hand with an anxious authority. "There is some mistake. Mr. Syme, I hardly think you understand your position. I arrest you in the name of the law." "Of the law?" said Syme, and dropped his stick. "Certainly," said the secretary. "I am a detective from Scotland Yard," and took a small blue card from his pocket. "And what do you suppose we are?" asked the professor, and threw up his arms. "You," said the secretary stiffly, "are, as I know for a fact, members of the Supreme Anarchist Council. Disguised as one of you, Dr. Bull turned and threw his sword into the sea." "There never was any Supreme Anarchist Council," he said. "We were all a lot of silly policemen looking at each other. And all these people who have been peppering us with shot, they thought we were the dynamiters. I knew I couldn't be wrong about the mob," he said, beaming over the enormous multitude which stretched itself away to the distance on both sides. "Vulgar people are never mad. I'm vulgar myself, and I know. I am now going on shore to stand a drink to everybody here." Chapter 13. The Pursuit of the President. And it looks like Audra's going to join us for a little bit here, maybe. Next morning, 5 bewildered but hilarious people took the boat for Dover. The poor old colonel might have had some cause to complain, having been first forced to fight for 2 factions that didn't exist, and then knocked down with an iron lantern. But he was a magnanimous old gentleman, and being much relieved that neither party had anything to do with dynamite, he saw them off on the pier with great geniality. The 5 reconciled detectives had 100 details to explain to each other. The secretary had to tell Syme how they had come to wear masks originally in order to approach the supposed enemy as fellow conspirators. Syme had to explain how they had fled with such swiftness through a civilized country. But above all those matters of detail which could be explained, rose the central mountain of the matter that they could not explain. What did it all mean? If they were all harmless officers, what was Sunday? If he had not seized the world, what on earth had he been up to? Inspector Ratcliffe was still gloomy about this. "I can't make head or tail of old Sunday's little game any more than you can," he said. "But whatever else Sunday is, he isn't a blameless citizen. Damn it, do you remember his face?" "I grant you," answered Syme, "that I have never been able to forget it." "Well," said the secretary, "I suppose we can find out soon, for tomorrow we have our next general meeting. You will excuse me," he said with a rather ghastly smile, "for being well acquainted with my secretarial duties." "I suppose you are right," said the professor reflectively. "I suppose we might find it out from him, but I confess I should feel a bit afraid of asking Sunday who he really is." "Why?" asked the secretary. "For fear of bombs?" "No," said the professor, "for fear he might tell me." "Let us have some drinks," said Bull, after a silence. Throughout their whole journey by boat and train they were highly convivial, but they instinctively kept together. Dr. Bull, who had always been the optimist of the party, endeavored to persuade the other 4 that the whole company could take the same hansom cab from Victoria, but this was overruled, and they went in a 4-wheeler, with Dr. Bull on the box singing. They finished their journey at a hotel in Piccadilly Circus, so as to be close to the early breakfast next morning in Leicester Square. Yet even then the adventures of the day were not entirely over. Dr. Bull, discontented with the general proposal to go to bed, had strolled out of the hotel. Oh dear. I think it's okay. Where was I? Dr. Bull, who had always been the optimist of the party, endeavored to persuade the other 4 that the whole company could take the same hansom cab from Victoria, but this was overruled, and they went in a 4-wheeler, with Dr. Bull on the box singing. They finished their journey at a hotel in Piccadilly Circus so as to be close to the early breakfast next morning in Leicester Square. Yet, even then, the adventures of the day were not entirely over. Dr. Bull, discontented with the general proposal to go to bed, had strolled out of the hotel at about 11 to see and taste some of the beauties of London. 20 minutes afterward, however, he came back and made quite a clamour in the hall. Syme, who tried at first to soothe him, was forced at last to listen to his communication with quite new attention. "I tell you, I've seen him," said Dr. Bull, with thick emphasis. "Whom?" asked Syme quickly. "Not the President." "Not so bad as that," said Dr. Bull with unnecessary laughter. "Not so bad as that. I've got him here." "Got whom here?" said Syme impatiently. "Harryman," said the other lucidly. "Man that used to be Harryman. Gogol. Here he is." And he pulled forward by a reluctant elbow the identical young man who 5 days before had marched out of the council with thin red hair and a pale face, the first of all the sham anarchists who had been exposed. "Why do you worry with me?" he cried. You have expelled me as a spy." "We are all spies," whispered Syme. "We are all spies!" shouted Dr. Bull. "Come and have a drink." The next morning the battalion of the reunited six marched stolidly toward the hotel in Leicester Square. "This is more cheerful," said Dr. Bull. "We are 6 men going to ask one man what he means." "I think it is a bit queerer than that," said Syme. "I think it is 6 men going to ask one man what they mean." They turned in silence into the square. Though the hotel was in the opposite corner, they saw at once the little balcony and figure that looked too big for it. He was sitting alone with a bent head, poring over a newspaper. But all his councillors who had come to vote him down crossed that square as if they were watched out of heaven by 100 eyes. They had disputed much upon their policy about whether they should leave the unmasked Gogol without and begin diplomatically, or whether they should bring him in and blow up the gunpowder at once. The influence of Simon Bull prevailed for the latter course, though the secretary to the last asked them why they attacked Sunday so rashly. "My reason is quite simple," said Syme. "I attacked him rashly because I'm afraid of him." They followed Syme up the dark stair in silence, and they all came out simultaneously into the broad sunlight of the morning and the broad sunlight of Sunday's smile. "Delightful!" he said. "So pleased to see you all. What an exquisite day it is. Is the Tsar dead?" The secretary, who happened to be foremost, drew himself together for a dignified outburst. "No," he said sternly, "there has been no massacre. I bring you news of no such disgusting spectacles." "Disgusting spectacles," repeated the president with a bright, inquiring smile. "You mean Dr. Bull's spectacles?" The secretary choked for a moment, and the president went on with a sort of smooth appeal. "Of course, we all have our opinions and even our eyes, but really to call them disgusting before the man himself." Dr. Bull tore off his spectacles and broke them on the table. "My spectacles are blackguardly," he said, "but I'm not. Look at my face." "I dare say it's the sort of face that grows on one," said the president. "In fact, it grows on you, and who am I to quarrel with the wild fruits upon the tree of life? I dare say it will grow on me some day." "We have no time for tomfoolery," said the secretary, breaking in savagely. "We have come to know what all this means. Who are you? What are you? Why did you get us all here? Do you know who and what we are? Are you a half-witted man playing the conspirator, or are you a clever man playing the fool? Answer me, I tell you." "Candidates," murmured Sunday, "are only required to answer to 8 out of the 17 questions on the paper. As far as I can make out, you want to tell me to tell you what I am and what you are, and what this table is, and what this council is, and what this world is, for all I know. Well, I will go so far as to rend the veil of one mystery. If you want to know what you are a set of highly well-intentioned young jackasses." "And you?" said Syme, leaning forward. "What are you?" "I? What am I?" roared the president, and he rose slowly to an incredible height, like some enormous wave about to arch above them and break. "You want to know what I am, do you? Bull, you are a man of science. Grub in the roots of those trees and find out the truth about them. Syme, you are a poet. Stare at those morning clouds and tell me or anyone the truth about morning clouds. But I tell you this, that you will have found out the truth of the last tree and the topmost cloud before the truth about me. You will understand the sea, and I shall still be a beginning be a riddle. You shall know what all the stars are and not know what I am. Since the beginning of the world, all men have hunted me like a wolf, kings and sages and poets and lawgivers and all the churches and all the philosophies. But I have never been caught yet, and the skies will fall in the time I turn to bay. I have given them a good run for their money, and I will now. Before one of them can move, the monstrous man had swung himself like some huge orangutan over the balustrade of the balcony. Yet before he dropped, he pulled himself out again, up again, as on a horizontal bar, and thrusting his great chin over the edge of the balcony, said solemnly, "There's one thing I'll tell you, though, about who I am. I am the man in the dark room, who made you all policemen." With that he fell from the balcony, bouncing on the stones below like a great ball of India rubber, and went bounding off toward the corner of the Alhambra, where he hailed a hansom cab and sprang inside it. The 6 detectives had been standing thunderstruck and livid in the light of his latest assertion, but when he disappeared into the cab, Syme's practical senses returned to him, and leaping over the balcony so recklessly as almost to break his legs, he called another cab. He and Bull sprang into the cab together, and the professor and inspector into another, while the secretary and the late Gogol scrambled into a third just in time to pursue the flying Syme, who was pursuing the flying president. 1 second. I need to check on something with my cats. Kitten. I think she's fine. All right. Okay. We're back again. Okay. Before one of them can move, the monstrous man had swung himself like some huge orangutan over the balustrade of the balcony. Yet before he dropped, he pulled himself up again as on a horizontal bar, and thrusting his great chin over the balcony, said solemnly, "There's one thing I'll tell you, though, about who I am. I am the man in the dark room, who made you all policemen." With that he fell from the balcony, bouncing on the streets below like a great ball of India rubber, and went bounding off toward the corner of the Alhambra, where he hailed a hansom cab and sprang inside it. The 6 detectives had been standing thunderstruck and livid in the light of his latest assertion, but when he disappeared into the cab, Syme's practical senses returned to him, and leaping over the balcony so recklessly as to almost break his legs, he called another cab. He and Bull sprang into the cab together, and the professor and the inspector into another, while the secretary and the late Gogol scrambled into a third just in time to pursue the flying Syme, who was pursuing the flying president. Sunday led them a wild chase toward the northwest. His cabman, evidently under the influence of more than common inducements, urged the horse at breakneck speed. But Syme was in no mood for delicacies, and he stood up in his own cab shouting, "Stop, thief!" until crowds ran along beside his cab, and policemen began to stop and ask questions. All this had its influence upon the president's cabman, who began to look dubious and to slow down to a trot. He opened the trap to talk reasonably to his fare, and in so doing let the long whip droop over the front of the cab. Sunday leaned forward, seized it, and jerked it violently out of the man's hand. Then, standing up in front of the cab himself, he lashed the horse and roared aloud so that they went down the streets like a flying storm. Through street after street and square after square went whirling this preposterous vehicle, in which the fare was urging the horse and driver trying desperately to stop it. The other 3 cabs came after it, if the phrase may be permissible of a cab, like panting hounds. Shops and streets shot by like rattling arrows. At the highest ecstasy of speed, Sunday turned round on the splashboard where he stood, and sticking his great grinning head out of the cab, with white hair whistling in the wind, he made a horrible face at his pursuers like some colossal urchin. Then, raising his right hand swiftly, he flung a ball of paper in Syme's face and vanished. Syme caught the thing while instinctively warding it off, and discovered that it consisted of 2 crumpled papers. One was addressed to himself, and the other to Dr. Bull, with a very long, and it is to be feared, partly ironical string of letters after his name. Dr. Bull's address was at any rate considerably longer than his communication, for the communication consisted entirely of the words, "What about Martin Tupper now?" "What does the old maniac mean?" asked Bull, staring at the words. "What does yours say, Syme?" Syme's message was at any rate longer, and ran as follows. No one would regret anything in the nature of an interference by the Archdeacon more than I. I trust it will not come to that. But for the last time, where are your goloshes? The thing is too bad, especially after what Uncle said. The President's cabman seemed to be regaining some control over his horse, and the pursuers gained a little as they swept round into Edgware Road, and there occurred what seemed to the Allies a providential stoppage. Traffic of every kind was swerving to the right or left, or stopping, for down the long road was coming the unmistakable roar announcing the fire engine, which in a few seconds went out by a brazen thunderbolt. But quick as it went by, Sunday had bounded out of his cab, sprung at the fire engine, caught it, slung himself on it, and was seen as he disappeared in the noisy distance talking to the astonished firemen with explanatory gestures. "After him," howled Syme. "He can't go astray now. There's no mistaking a fire engine." The three cabmen, who had been stunned for a moment, whipped up their horses and slightly decreased the distance between themselves and their disappearing prey. The President acknowledged this proximity by coming to the back of the car, bowing repeatedly, kissing his hand, and finally flinging a neatly folded note into the bosom of Inspector Ratcliffe. When that gentleman opened it, not without impatience, he found it contained the words, "Fly at once. The truth about your trouser-stretchers is known. A friend." The fire engine had struck still farther to the north, into a region that they did not recognize, and as it ran by a line of high railings shadowed with trees, the six friends were startled, but somewhat relieved, to see the President leap from the fire engine, though whether through another whim or the increasing protest of his entertainers they could not see. Before the three cabs, however, could reach up to the spot, he had gone up the high railings like a huge grey cat, tossed himself over, and vanished into a darkness of leaves. Syme, with a furious gesture, stopped his cab, jumped out, and sprang also to the escalade. When he had one leg over the fence, and his friends were following, he turned a face on them which shone quite pale in the shadow. "What place can this be?" he asked. "Can it be the old devil's house? I've heard he had a house in North London." "All the better," said the secretary, grimly planting a foot in a foothold. "We shall find him at home." "No, but it isn't that," said Syme, knitting his brows. "I hear the most horrible noises, like devils laughing and sneezing and blowing their devilish noses." "His dog's barking, of course," said the secretary. "Why not say his black beetle's barking?" said Syme furiously. "Snails barking! Geraniums barking! Have you ever heard a dog bark like that?" He held up his hand, and there came out of the thicket a long, growling roar that seemed to get under the skin and freeze the flesh, a low, thrilling roar that made a throbbing in the air all about them. "The dogs of Sunday would be no ordinary dogs," said Giggle, and shuddered. Syme had jumped down the other side, but he stood listening impatiently. "Well, listen to that," he said. "Is that a dog? Anybody's dog?" There broke upon their ear a hoarse screaming as of things protesting and clamouring in sudden pain, and then far off like an echo, what sounded like a long nasal trumpet. "Well, his house ought to be in hell," said the secretary, "and if it is hell, I'm going in." And he sprang over the tall railings, almost with one swing. The others followed. They broke through a tangle of plants and shrubs and came out on an open path. Nothing was in sight, but Dr. Bull suddenly struck his hands together. "Why, you asses!" he cried. "It's the zoo!" As they were looking round for any wild trace of their wild quarry, a keeper in uniform came running along the path with a man in plain clothes. "Has it come this way?" gasped the keeper. "Has what?" asked Syme. "The elephant!" cried the keeper. "An elephant has gone mad and run away." "He has run away with an old gentleman," said the other stranger breathlessly. "A poor old gentleman with white hair." "What sort of old gentleman?" asked Syme with great curiosity. "A very large and fat old gentleman in light grey clothes," said the keeper eagerly. "Well," said Syme, "if he's that particular kind of old gentleman, if you're quite sure that he's a large and fat old gentleman in grey clothes, you may take my word for it that the elephant has not run away with him. He has run away with the elephant. The elephant is not made by God that could run away with him if he did not consent to the elopement. And by thunder, there he is." There was no doubt about it this time. Clean across the space of grass, about 200 yards away, with a crowd screaming and scampering vainly at his heels, went a huge grey elephant at an awful stride, with his trunk thrown out as rigid as a ship's bowsprit, and trumpeting like the trumpet of doom. On the back of the bellowing and plunging animals sat President Sunday with all the placidity of a sultan, but goading the animal to a furious speed with some sharp object in his hand. "Stop him!" screamed the populace. "He'll be out of the gate!" "Stop a landslide!" said the keeper. "He is out of the gate!" And even as he spoke, a final crash and roar of terror announced that the great gray elephant had broken out of the gates of the Zoological Gardens and was careering down Albany Street like a new and swift sort of omnibus. "Great Lord!" cried Bull. "I never knew an elephant could go so fast. Well, it must be hansom cabs again if we are to keep him in sight." As they raced along to the gate out of which the elephant had vanished, Syme felt a glaring panorama of the strange animals in the cages which they passed. Afterward he thought it queer that he should have seen them so clearly. He remembered especially seeing pelicans with their preposterous pendant throats. He wondered why the pelican was the symbol of charity, except it was that it wanted a good deal of charity to admire a pelican. He remembered a hornbill, which was simply a huge yellow beak with a small bird tied on behind it. The whole gave him a sensation, the vividness of which he could not explain, that nature was always making quite mysterious jokes. Sunday had told them that they would understand him when they had understood the stars. He wondered whether even the archangels understood the hornbill. The 6 unhappy detectives flung themselves into cabs and followed the elephant, sharing the terror which he spread through the long stretch of the streets. This time Sunday did not turn around, but offered them the solid stretch of his unconscious back, which maddened them, if possible, more than his previous mockeries. Just before they came to Baker Street, however, he was seen to throw something far up into the air, as a boy does a ball, meaning to catch it again. But as at their rate of racing it fell far behind, just by the cab containing Gogol, and in faint hopes of a clue, or for some impulse unexplainable, he stopped his cab so as to pick it up. It was addressed to himself, and it was quite a bulky parcel. On examination, however, its bulk was found to consist of 33 pieces of paper of no value wrapped one around another. When the last covering was torn away, it reduced itself to a small slip of paper on which was written, "The word, I fancy, should be pink." The man once known as Gogol said nothing, but the movements of his hands and feet were like those of a man urging a horse to renewed effort. Through street after street, through district after district, went the prodigy of the flying elephant, calling crowds to every window and driving the traffic left and right. And still through all this insane publicity, 3 cabs toiled after it until they came to be regarded as part of a procession, and perhaps the advertisement of a circus. They went at such a rate that distances were shortened beyond belief, and Syme saw the Albert Hall in Kensington when he thought that he was still in Paddington. The animal's pace was even more fast and free through the empty aristocratic streets of South Kensington, and he was finally headed toward that part of the skyline where the enormous wheel of the Earl's Court stood up in the sky. The wheel grew larger and larger till it filled the heaven like the wheel of stars. The beast outstripped the cabs. They lost him round several corners, and when they came to one of the gates of the Earl's Court exhibition, they found themselves finally blocked. In front of them was an enormous crowd. In the midst of it was an enormous elephant, heaving and shuddering as such shapeless creatures do. But the president had disappeared. "Where has he gone to?" asked Syme, slipping to the ground. "Gentlemen rushed into the exhibition, sir," said an official in a dazed manner. Then he added in an injured voice, "Funny gentleman, sir, asked me to hold his horse and gave me this." He held out with distaste a piece of folded paper addressed to the secretary of the Central Anarchist Council. The secretary, raging, rent it open, and found written inside it, "When the herring runs a mile, let the secretary smile. When the herring tries to fly, let the secretary die." Rustic proverb. "Why the crikey," began the secretary, "did you let the man in? Do people commonly come to your exhibition riding on mad elephants? Look!" shouted Syme suddenly. "Look over there!" "Look at what?" said the secretary savagely. "Look at the captive balloon," said Syme, pointed in frenzy. "Why the blazes should I look at a captive balloon?" demanded the secretary. "What is there queer about a captive balloon?" "Nothing," said Syme, "except that it isn't captive." They all turned their eyes to where the balloon swung and swelled above the exhibition on a string, like a child's balloon. A second afterwards the string came into just under the car, and the balloon, broken loose, floated away with the freedom of a soap bubble. 10,000 devils! Shrieked the secretary. He's got into it! And shook his fist at the sky. The balloon, borne by some chance wind, came right above them, and they could see the great white head of the president peering over the side and looking benevolently down upon them. God bless my soul, said the professor with the elderly manner that he could never disconnect from his bleached beard and parchment face. God bless my soul, I seem to fancy that something fell on the top of my hat. He put up a trembling hand and took from that shelf a piece of twisted paper, which he opened absently, only to find it inscribed with a true lover's knot and the words, Your beauty has not left me indifferent, from little Snowdrop. There was a short silence, and then Syme said, biting his beard, I'm not beaten yet. The blasted thing must come down somewhere. Let's follow it.